Okay, so I don't have a PowerPoint for chapter 8, at least I don't have right now as I'm recording this. And that's something that I do intentionally in class. Sometimes I do with PowerPoint, sometimes I do it without, because different people learn different ways, and it's good to have a change. It's good to have different types, different methods for you to actually retain the material. So what we're going to do here, instead of me being able to write on the board, because I can't do exactly that here, I'm going to have maybe a couple of slides, a few, but they're not going to directly relate to what I'm saying necessarily. Okay, because the one you're probably looking at now is going to have the title of that chapter on it, but and a picture. Okay, but that's not going to be all spelled out. So you're going to have to listen to the lecture and you're going to have to take notes. And I've had several people, not from your class, absolutely, I know it wasn't from your class because I'm pretty sure I know where pretty much all of the ones that have done this came from. But you're going to have to listen and take notes because I've had those emails that say things like, well, I have a question about my exam or my quiz or whatever. Well, I never heard you talk about that on the lecture. And then what I do is I go back and I find where I talked about it, and then I put the time, the timestamp on it, and send them the link and show them exactly what I was talking about. So pay attention. If you don't take notes, you really aren't going to get nearly as much out of either the full PowerPoint experience or even partially audio, maybe a little bit of PowerPoint, however this one works out. So that's just word to the wise to help you. And again, I'm glad that so many of you in this class, in your class, have communicated with me. Some of you have been pretty good at keeping up some communication with me, and I really appreciate that. So I'm going to start right here with Church in the High Middle Ages. So let's look back a little bit and say, okay, first of all, define the High Middle Ages. Somewhere is around 1000 or about 1050 to 1400. So starting in the 11th century, going to the 15th century. And the Europeans had finally gotten a break from all these invaders. Remember the ones we talked about in the last invasions that were coming were the men that we call the Vikings sometimes, the men from the north, the Norsemen, and the Magyars and the Saracens. Okay, that was the last big group of invaders. So a lot of them, they're going to be absorbed and assimilated into European culture by this particular time. If they're not completely absorbed, they're certainly getting there in many ways. So you're also going to see other parts of the people that had been invading. For example, the Muslims who were invading at some point, when Charles Martel and the Franks stopped them from getting into Western Europe. That was in 732 at the Battle of Tours, or the Battle of Poitiers or Poitiers. I don't know French. I don't even pretend like I know French, y'all. But anyway, it was going to be a sign that the Muslims were having some trouble. They were having some trouble uniting. And we're going to see that also with the early crusade. The Crusades, the first crusade, the Muslims are going to have a real problem uniting and organizing themselves into a big, meaningful force against the Europeans. So a lot of the Muslims are not having any luck getting invasions into Europe anymore. So anyway, what happens is one way or the other, by about 1000 or about 1050, we see that Europe is moving from just having to defend themselves and protect themselves from all these different invaders to an area that's growing. Okay, and we don't see all these countries yet that we will see eventually, but they're gonna eventually come. Okay, now by the 1100s, there's all kinds of other things happening. So during the Middle Ages, during the period we call the Dark Ages, which I told you was somewhere around 500 to somewhere around 1000 AD. And during that time, the cities shrank. One reason the cities shrank was because Well, people were leaving for all sorts of different reasons, but the cities are just not going to be quite as necessary or as well advanced and sophisticated as they had been during the Roman Empire. Okay, particularly during the Roman Empire, a while before it actually kind of crumbled. But the cities are just not going to be the great cultural spots that they had been for quite a while. They had been going down. So by the 1100s, somewhere in the 1100s, we start to see cities growing again. We start to see new cities being built. Okay. Now, this is a sign of something really important because during feudalism, remember, you're looking to the local men. You're looking to the local, like the local strong man for a while, and then feudalism comes up, and feudalism is this whole entire organization of society, and you know where you belong, and you know the lord above you, and you might have a vassal or many vassals, or, in other words, all of that stuff that we talked about with feudalism and much more. But what we see, though, is we have a revival of trade as feudalism's still going to be around, but as feudalism is reacting to this revival of trade. And this is going to cause a shift in the culture. See, if you lived under feudalism in a manner that was controlled by a lord, and he bartered or he minted his own money, well, money wasn't going to be that important in feudalism in a lot of places. So the revival of trade with foreign powers, okay, you're going to see people starting to go further and further east to trade. And also another big change that's happening here is early universities. The foundations and the earliest universities really are going to be springing up. And a lot of these early universities happen at the cathedrals of European bishops. Okay, for example, the Cathedral of Notre Dame. That is going to be one of the early universities. Okay, now remember, we have to distinguish between Plato calling, or some people calling Plato's Academy the first Western college, first college in the Western world or whatever. But universities are different because remember, universities go a little bit higher and more specific in what they're teaching. Now, remember, the Romans had sort of moved along toward universities, but it's going to be because of the cathedrals that we're going to get our earliest university. Now, you also see then, related to the church, because that's what this chapter is about, it's going to be a time where European intellectualism, European knowledge and learning of all sorts of things is going to start to thrive again. Okay, now, one thing that we did see that was going on in the church also at this time was the monasteries were being attacked as the invaders had come in. Okay, a little bit earlier, go back, a little bit earlier, and you saw a lot of that. Now, it's still happening for a while in the 11th century, and there's going to be a lot of raids of monasteries, stealing what they have, sometimes killing them and all that. But you have other things like being secular in the church. You're a priest, or you're a monk, or someone who is actually living a secular or a worldly life without Jesus, without God and the church. So that's a big thing that was happening in the church for a while. And these things are happening, all of this crazy stuff here is happening partially due to the lack of a central government. Okay, remember, a central government, that's where you're going to have like a president, you're going to have some kind of bureaucracy tied to the president or a king or whatever, and they're going to have a lot of power to make the decisions. Now, if you go back, feudalism, you're going to see that the lords had that power within their areas, the manor, remember, okay, in a bigger, area. Okay, so there's something bigger than the lords. But remember, as we talked about before, the king is supposedly the biggest feudal lord, but not really in power. Okay, that's more of a title or something that's maybe given to the king out of some sort of prestige or something for being the king. But the centralized government of Rome had fallen back, around 500. So the church, what they own, the Catholic Church is going to be the most powerful and the largest institution in the West during the Middle Ages. And some of what they had as wealth was dependent on the local nobles, okay? Because the nobles are going to protect the church. Now remember, especially, it starts with the Franks. The Franks, when we have Clovis converts to Catholicism, then all of all of the Franks, they're going to convert as well. As I said, half jokingly, because it was true, whether they knew it or not, right? Now, they were Catholic at that time. So this is going to give these people sometimes that we call lay people a lot more power than they probably needed. Okay, so first we're going to have to knock out here what is lay or lay people or the laity, something like that. Okay, so on slide number 2, I've got a definition of what the laity is, what lay person, lay people, laymen, all, and what that actually means. And we're going to talk about something called the lay investiture crisis, the lay investiture controversy. It has several different names for this big trouble that came up in the church during this time. But to go back and reiterate, the church was very powerful and they needed protection from the nobility in their areas. So each of the local churches needed protection from nobles in their area. So again, some of these laymen, okay, nobles who were not ordained as deacons or priests or bishops, or they're not in any of the holy orders. They're not a member of what you call the religious. They're not again sisters or nuns or monks or any of that. So many things. And I know I left some out, but you're going to have that a lot of these lay people, these laymen in particular, in some areas decided that they did want some more power and they started making church appointments. Now, the problem with that is, okay, it was in direct conflict with the Pope and the church's claims on spiritual authority, because you have these men who are not part of the actual bureaucracy that makes up the church appointing bishops and so on. And that's going to be extraordinarily bad for the church, because at this particular time, some of the church officials are going to be there for the material benefits. And many of these church officials are going to be loyal to the local rulers. Okay. So if they're not the number one big ruler in that area, a lot of them are going to be loyal to the local rulers. So anyway, you bring some of these church officials in. Hey, I'm a local powerful man in one area, and I appoint my friend. He wants to be a member of the he wants to be a member of the church in terms of holding an office, right? So many of these church office holders or officials wanted to make some money for themselves. So when you talk to, say, your friend and you're like, I know you've got power. I know you're very powerful around here. Can you get me an appointment to an office in the church? I'll pay you. Okay. Why would they pay except for the fact that they're thinking they're going to make some more money out of it? This is a terrible thing because a lot of times the ones who are appointed by the laymen didn't really know much about the theology of the church. And that's terrible. I mean, I've said this for years. I've stood in front of the class, and I'm like, all right, look, let's say you're religious, you're not religious, say, anything. Do you think that it would be good for your church or your whatever, your club? Let's say you have a club. Would it be good for people to appoint someone outside of that church or that mosque or that club or that whatever? Would it be good to appoint them and they don't really care about what you believe in as a member of that whatever organization? No, of course not. So this is going to hurt the church because you've got some guys in there that are not interested in the theology and taking care of keeping the church, moving toward what it was believed, that God wanted them to do. So simony, as it's pronounced, is a problem that is related, directly with this whole issue of lay investiture. It was named after a guy they sometimes call Simon the Magician, who is mentioned in a story in the New Testament in the book of Acts, who tried to buy power supposedly from St. Peter and the apostles. And simony is named after him. It means, also the purchase of any kind of spiritual things, right? So a broad definition of it could be that you're buying something spiritual, but you're getting something material for that spiritual, whatever it is, right? So if you get an office because you provided services for someone who had the power to appoint you, or somehow you were able to literally purchase an office because you were the one who made the highest bid on that office. That's the thing. Like I said, you could, as a as an official in the church during that time, you could make some money just from doing that, from serving in those kind of positions. So this is going to also contribute to the secularness and the lack of real spiritual focus from a lot of church officials who really, as I said before, didn't know much of the theology of the Catholic Church at all. So simony is going to be a part of, again, the lay investiture thing. Like you're going to say someone is going to appoint a cleric, a priest, a bishop, or whatever, and they're going to receive an oath binding that cleric to whatever duties the ruler, the one that appointed you to, wants to put on that priest or bishop or whatever, right? So again, the service that was given to the person who appointed you, the Lord, let's say, in that region, was a way to honor that Lord and accept that position. Oops, sorry, I had to stop recording for a minute. My son was in there playing a game and apparently talking through his headphones, but that doesn't make it very quiet for me. You may have even heard him back there getting pretty loud. But anyway, as I was saying, what was I saying? Oh yeah. So anyway, if you get that appointment, you become, someone in this position in the church, then you're going to be expected to give something back to the person who appointed you. Again, this is a way of accepting that role and honoring the person that gave you that role and all that kind of stuff. Okay. So the role of money is going to be important when people see that trade is returning and money's becoming very important again. to the, to the world, and there's less bartering, and there's going to be eventually, it won't be too long before we start to see the ways of feudalism really dying down. Okay, so money starts to be important, which means that if you're buying and selling things like church offices, that's going to be reflected in, you know, the appointment to church offices, money or whatever that you're doing to honor accepting that particular office or spiritual gift, usually in that form. Now, what we have is between church and state in the Middle Ages, the lay investiture controversy is going to be if not the biggest, one of the biggest of these kind of struggles between the church, as in the Roman Catholic Church, and the state, in this case, as in the German states in particular. So if you look back at feudalism and you study it for a little bit, you're going to see that the word investiture is a feudal word. Okay, it's a ceremony where you have a lord giving a benefice or giving land to his vassal. Okay, we sort of talked about that. And then in return, the vassal is actually going to take an oath to do no harm to his lord, to help his lord when needed, and all that, right? So generally speaking, in investiture, you're going to have the vassal getting land from a lord. So that's where that word comes from. But when we're talking about, say, the lay investiture controversy, okay, in church law, you have a cleric who is elected receiving some symbols, okay, symbols of the spiritual office, a ring and a staff in particular, okay. I'm trying to think. I met the archbishop in the diocese here a few weeks ago. It was before a lot of stuff had happened with the pandemic, but I'm trying to remember. He did have a staff at certain times, and assuming he had a ring. He's the archbishop, or anyway. Those are symbols though of the office. Whatever office you're serving in. Now, that's in church law, so you're getting something. Instead of in feudalism, you're getting land. In the church, you're getting some symbols of spiritual office. And when you receive those, it means that now you have that office. That is something that has been given to you. Okay? Now, the problem is going to be that there are some important bishops who are again, pretty high ranking sometimes in the church, of course, and abbots who are the head of some monasteries who are worldly as well as spiritual lords. So this is going to be really confusing for people when you see the king and the pope both having a hand in who's going to appoint the officials to the Catholic Church. As I said, do you want people who are not on board with what you believe, even if it's just, as I mentioned earlier, a club? You have a set of rules. Do you want someone to be appointed to a leadership position from outside of that belief system? No. And what that does is that weakens the church in that way. Okay, so we're continuing on here with the lay investiture crisis or controversy, and give you a little bit of background. You've got by the late 1000s, by the late 11th century. Okay, right? Yeah. There's really no complete agreement as to the power of the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor, which one can really put in the German bishops. Okay, it was recognized that they both had rights to do some of that installing, but where did the line? Where was the line between the Holy Roman Emperor's power and the Pope's power? Okay, so you're going to see that investiture means something different than it did for the most part in feudalism. Remember, where you're going to see the guy swears loyalty, the vassal swears loyalty to the Lord, and he gets land. And we talked about in church, in things like this, the ceremony itself, the whole matter of putting them in there and giving them maybe, a staff and a ring and whatever, okay? Lay investiture becomes what we call putting in these clerks by a king or an emperor who is a layman, okay? He's not a member of the clergy of the church. So you'll see a couple of little conflicts that come up in the earlier 1100s, and that's going to be people that we're going to kind of skip over and get you to the two big ones, okay? The two that really start this imperial papal conflict, the big conflict between church and state. And that's going to be Pope Gregory VII and Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV. Anyway, they're going to be the ones that really start this big struggle that we come to call the lay investiture controversy. So it's important that the church has the power of selecting the bishops, because there are a lot of people who wanted church reform. Like there's a lot of people in the church who wanted to get rid of simony, to get rid of marriage of the clerics, right? And they wanted other things to happen that were not going to happen if you didn't have people in the church who wanted change making these appointments. So the reformers decided that they needed to completely get rid of lay investiture. That's the only way it's going to happen. So in 1075, Pope Gregory VII decided to make it, forbidden, verboten. You can't practice lay investiture. Okay, I don't care if you are the Holy Roman Emperor. You're a worldly leader. I'm the Pope. It's my church, so you can't do this anymore. What happened was Henry IV in Germany, as in the German areas, as the Holy Roman Emperor, Henry IV is going to have a bunch of nobles who have been trying to get rid of him for a while. And so they're going to be pretty happy when Henry IV is going to get in trouble with the Pope. Okay, so what we see here is there's a lot of different things going on, but in a nutshell, we're going to have Henry IV going ahead and doing what he wants to do, and then, which is appoint bishops, and he is excommunicated by Pope Gregory VII. So his nobles, the ones who want him out and don't like him for whatever reasons, okay, they are going to take this as a sign that they should try to actually remove him. So, why? Why are they taking that as a sign? He's been excommunicated from the church, which means that if they, as his subjects, keep him as their legitimate emperor, then they might be going against, the church, because there's the idea that if a leader was excommunicated from the church, then you don't have to follow them anymore. So in the simplest way to put this, those nobles were taking advantage of the fact that there was this conflict going on between the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor. So you're going to have, 40-something, 50 years of civil war that are going to follow. But the emperor feels like he needs to have some power over his bishops in the German states. So in 1076, the German bishops are going to meet and they're going to declare the papacy of Gregory the Seventh invalid. Okay, so this is where the official excommunication by Henry IV happens, and this is where they got their idea that it was okay to try to throw Henry out of his position, or that's actually called depose him from being the emperor, the Holy Roman Emperor. So you've got the German bishops declaring the Pope to be an invalid Pope. Okay? The Pope then excommunicating Henry, kicking him out of the Catholic Church. He's not allowed to take the sacraments and everything. And then the nobles attack Henry. So what's going to happen? Well, it's a long story. Let me see if I can shorten this a little bit. All right. So Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV decided that he was going to have to get back in the church. And he made this journey to a place called Canossa in northern Italy, where the Pope was going to have to forgive him. So the thing is, if you have a repentant sinner who comes to make a confession as a member of the clergy, you're required to hear the confession of a repentant sinner. Okay, keep that in mind. Because in class, I'm going to ask you something in class. I'm going to pretend like we're in class, and I'm going to kind of ask you and let you think about it for a second when we get there. But Gregory was pretty much, obliged to forgive and absolve him after hearing his confession. So Henry went, on this trip to Canossa, and this happened in January of the year 1077. So what happened when he got there, and there's all kinds of stories. There's stories that Henry went there and stood out in the snow barefoot for a day and a half or 3 days, or there's different stories of this. And I'm like, wait a minute, somebody's taking some poetic license here. What really happened? Well, what we know happened was Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV went to Canossa, and we know that he tried to get an audience with the Pope, and Pope Gregory VII said no several times. And Henry supposedly was wearing a hair shirt, which is uncomfortable. It's something, as a means of penance and, whatever. And Gregory's like, no. Now, I just told you guys, I said, a member of the clergy is required to hear the confession of a repentant sinner. And Gregory was like, no. How could the Pope do that? Well, the answer to that question is right in what I just said. And I'll go ahead and make it quick for you, because in class, somebody would usually catch it and raise their hand by now. Okay? If a member of the clergy refuses to hear your confession, there's only one reason. Okay? And this is the reason Gregory said. Gregory said, no, Henry's not repentant. He's not a penitent sinner. He doesn't want to repent, which means to change, to turn away from sin, to go forward. So Gregory didn't hear his confession for a while. But then after a while, he was convinced. He's like, wow, he must really, really want to repent. So Gregory did hear his confession, and he put Henry back into the church again. So at that point, the princes over there, who were the nobles who were rebelling against Henry IV, knew that now he was back in the church had made him the legitimate ruler again, so they really couldn't keep rebelling and trying to kick him out, right, or to depose him. Okay, now what happens, though, is in, let's see, hang on. Make sure I don't leave anything. I'm trying to shorten it without leaving anything out. Yeah, you're going to see that within a while, Henry was going back to appointing bishops, and he got excommunicated a second time. And, there's just all kinds of things that happen as far as that goes. You're also going to see Henry appointing his own bishop or his own pope, rather. I'm sorry. He's going to end up appointing his own pope. Someone does something like that, that pope is called an anti-pope or an anti-pope. And this guy was Clement III. So that's not the end of the whole lay investiture struggle, though. It's not just between this particular emperor and this particular pope. So by 1080, like I said, that's when everything had kind of happened between those two. That was when Henry put in the anti-pope, Clement III, and he's going to crown Henry as emperor again in somewhere around there, around 1080 something. Now, Pope Gregory VII, though, is going to have to actually take off and leave because it's dangerous for him at that point with the anti-pope, and he's going to leave and die in exile the next year after he leaves. So as I said, it continues on. Now, the controversy is not going to end until the Concordant of Worms, W-O-R-M-S, okay, it's a place in Germany, okay, of 1122, okay, so that's where we'll start on the next slide. So the Concordant of Worms is actually spelled out on your next slide, the one that we're on right now, actually. So in this concordant, in this agreement, the church and the state come to this kind of a compromise, okay? So the church is going to have the right to elect the bishops and give the power of the office symbolized by the ring and staff to those bishops. The king is going to have the right to give the feudal lands and any worldly power that went with the office. Now listen to this part though. The king or the emperor can refuse to accept the homage, okay, can refuse to accept this loyalty from a bishop candidate. Since the candidate was trying, going by feudalism, to be the king or the emperor's vassal. So see, the emperor is still going to have some power over who becomes bishop in his territory in the German states. So to lay it just all out straight up, what happened here is the church gained some power because even though the king could say no, refuse to accept a bishop candidate, the king could not bring up the original candidates. Okay, the king can't appoint people he knows. The emperor, the king, is going to have to pick from a pool that the church has chosen. Okay, so the church has gained some power in that way. The quality of the church leaders definitely increased because it's a lot harder for these lay emperors and kings to force candidates into those offices that are there only for the possibility of making money, because the church still having the power to give them the ecclesiastical and to give them the spiritual powers that go with that office, symbolized by the ring and the staff, for example. It's going to be a lot more difficult because the church is not going to let those guys in. They're not just going to let anybody in there. And remember, as I mentioned before, the controversy had cut down some of the power of the Holy Roman Empire and led to several years of civil war, about 50 years. And the German Empire had centralized by that time, had become, remember, you have Charlemagne being crowned Holy Roman Emperor, but he didn't really care about that. But by the time we got down to Henry IV, and before that, they were considering themselves to be emperors of that entire German territory. So you're going to see the German Empire, a united German Empire, is going to move away from a strong central government and kind of go back toward feudalism for a while. Now, we in History 105, we do the unification of Germany, which is not going to happen completely until 1871. So again, you're going to have fits and starts and breaks as the Germans are figuring out what they're going to do, and they're not actually going to become a country that we call Germany until 1871. So the Crusades. Well, the Crusades are called the Holy Crusades later by the church, and sometime here also in the 11th century, the people in Western Europe are going to start this series of armed crusades going over toward Constantinople into the east. And the Crusaders each are going to swear a vow that, when they successfully reach Jerusalem, they're going to be playing their role to free the Holy Land from the Muslims who've taken control of it a while back. So as they start out on this crusade, each one of the crusaders is going to be given a cloth cross, okay? It's called a crux, C-R-U-X, to be sewn in somewhere into their clothing. This is called the taking of the cross, right? And this is kind of where we get the word crusade. So I think your book gives you a pretty broad definition of crusades. We're gonna stick to the ones that are recognized as the traditional crusades. And the traditional crusades, there's either 8 or 9, depending on if you count the 9th one. But it's really clear why the crusades happen, okay? The West wants to free the Holy Lands from the Muslims. As I said, it's going to come about as what's called the Holy Land is holy to the 3 major monotheistic religions of the world. Okay, you've got first Judaism, and then Christianity, and then Islam, which came about in the 7th century. So it's considered holy to all 3 of those religions. So the first crusade was really part of a larger revivalism of religion, and the popes are going to be out there, calling for taking back the Holy Land, and going to get people really excited about this. And some of the people who were really, some of the people who were there, and they listened to some of the speeches made by some of the popes and some of the other preachers of crusade, they're going to get really interested in going and doing their part to free the Holy Land from the Islamic influences. So Europe had calmed down. As I said earlier, there weren't all these invasions anymore. So what had started happening was the Europeans had started kind of fighting amongst themselves. See, I read somewhere, I don't remember where it was I read it, I'm not sure. But I did read somewhere that those medieval knights were a cantankerous bunch, right? The ones that are the mounted warriors, that's a whole, the word knight, K-N-I-G-H-T, that evolves a lot over the time of feudalism and the whole medieval period. But they're kind of cantankerous. They kind of like to fight. So now they don't have anybody to fight, so they've started fighting each other. Now, that's going to come into light in just a minute. But the Crusades are showing us also this original expansion of the West into these new lands at that time, and the movement from Europe that these people are going to make that really starts really right there in the 11th century. Okay, so as I said, it's the Holy Land to the 3 major monotheistic religions of the world. And as of what, 1059, you're going to see that the Roman Catholic Church there's a schism in the church. There's a break, and you're going to have the Eastern Church. Remember the Byzantine Empire. You're going to have over there the Byzantine Church, or the Eastern Orthodox Church, or the Orthodox Church, or the Greek Orthodox Church, whatever you want to call it over there. But anyway, the East and West had split, and so Pope Gregory the Seventh, if you go back when we were talking about the lay investiture controversy, Pope Gregory the Seventh, he even wanted to reunite the Orthodox Church with the Roman Catholic Church. And he wanted to go ahead and, extend some holy war from Spain to Asia and all kinds of stuff. So all sorts of maybe all sorts of events were happening, and everything was kind of lining up. Something needed to happen, but you see, what really sets it off is going to be when Pope Urban II is going to carry on in the tradition of reform of Pope Gregory VII. Okay, Pope Urban II is going to get an ambassador who has a message from the Byzantine Emperor Alexei. And Alexei is asking for the Pope to send help. Okay, fellow Christians, send help because the Turks are taking over. Okay, now Pope Urban is going to make a speech at a place called Clermont in France that I always say is probably the most effective speech in European history, because he's going to start it's in France, okay, Clermont, France. So he's going to be talking to French people, but there's also going to be other people from the church there. There's going to be other bishops from some other places in Europe, but he's going to tell the Europeans, he's going to sort of chastise them and tell them to stop fighting each other and go take the Holy Land from the hands of the Muslims. Okay, so there's a part of the speech that sometimes I read in class, and what I'm going to do is, because of this, the confines of this, well, that's something that I just read from his speech, but really it's applicable though. From the confines of this type of communication, I'm going to go and find that, and I'm going to post it for you, because that's something I usually have to read to you out loud and kind of, show you what Pope Urban was saying, just in part, just parts of what he's saying that gets the people who were in attendance at Clermont just fired up for a crusade. So again, on the next slide, I just went and found it and copied the excerpt that I usually read in class. So read that, and you can see he's using language to get the people who are there to understand that they need to go somewhere other than within their own territories to fight, that there's a bigger fight over there to get the Holy Land. And he tells all these terrible things that he has heard that are happening over in the Holy Land being carried out by the Muslims. And Pope Urban II is going to really emphasize the fact that, Emperor Alexei from, over in the East needs their help, and that these Eastern Christians are really in a terrible place. And so what had happened was, sometime in here, a while before this, there was a Muslim ruler named Hakim, Hakim. I won't ask you a question about him, but just so you know, he had actually stopped allowing Christians to go into the Christian shrines and to go into those areas of the Holy Land. And anyway, so Pope Urban says that it's really, he's telling them how difficult it is for Christians to go into Jerusalem and places that they would like to go and walk where Jesus had walked. So he told whoever was listening to him, it doesn't matter who you are, whether you're noble, whether you're a commoner, Just, you need to get into an army and God will help you. Okay? Don't kill each other anymore. Go and fight for the Holy Land. Don't stay here at home where we're poor and we're struggling. Go over to the East, and there's wealth over in the East. Bring that back. That'll help. And if you're killed doing the work of God, you're automatically absolved of your sins and assured of salvation. Okay? So the audience at the end, like I said, the audience is fired up, and they start saying, God wills it. They start chanting it in Latin. Now, the first crusade had been launched. Now, that's the first crusade that's being launched right there. And I want to tell you kind of a sidebar about the People's Crusade. Okay, the People's Crusade. And that'll be on the next slide. So the People's Crusade is also known as the Peasants' Crusade. And this was not an official crusade, but it was, the whole story comes about because of a character named Peter the Hermit, or called Peter the Hermit, who's supposedly an old man who lived out by himself on, fish and wine. And he was an effective preacher of crusade. Was he at Claremont when Pope Urban II gave his speech? We don't really know. But somehow in France and some of the German areas, he recruited a whole lot of peasants, just regular people, like, including women. And he had them convinced that he was leading them to the New Jerusalem, a place that was flowing with milk and honey and all these great things according to the Bible. And they wanted to follow him. So they follow him up to the Rhine. They go across, Hungary. And there's a riot over a pair of shoes. Okay, you end up with 4,000 people killed. So this is a strange group heading over to Constantinople. And the interesting thing is they got there before the actual crusaders. Remember the knights, the nobles, the ones who've actually learned how to fight, right? Well, these guys get there first, and you can only imagine what Emperor Alexei must have thought when he saw these guys, and he was thinking, oh my goodness, who did the Pope send to me? Well, over there in the Byzantine Empire, they didn't calm down anymore. These guys under, Peter the Hermit's, I wouldn't say under his guidance, but under his leadership in a way, because he had brought them together, they are going to actually start burning people's houses. They're going to steal everything in sight, including they're going to steal lead from the roofs of some of the churches. Okay? So it's absolutely, completely crazy. Now, once they cross over, once Emperor Alexei's aware of them, like I say, he ships them off to Constantinople, or off from Constantinople as quickly as possible. And remember, they're going over there to fight the Muslims and get the Muslim Turks and get the Holy Land. But when they get over there, they start fighting amongst themselves, as they always had been. And then they start fighting with Christians who are over there. And they don't really kill any Muslims or take any ground from the Muslims. Eventually, they cause so much trouble that Peter the Hermit and his group were just massacred. Okay? So that was a little sidebar, because that is not an official crusade. But you need to know it was something interesting that happened. So I don't really go through all the crusades, because we just don't simply ever have time to do that. There's so much more detail. But basically, in the first crusade, the European Christians are going to win. Okay? You're going to have Antioch, which is going to become the first, I believe, crusader state that's going to be established, which means, or was it Edessa? I think it may have been Edessa, but you're going to have some different states that the Christians are going to seize, and those are going to be called the crusader states. And then other crusaders are going to take Jerusalem by 1099, and you're going to see this really, really awful slaughter of 10,000 or more Muslims and Jews, men, women, children, and it's going to be, it's wartime, and it's, it's what's happening. Now, during the First Crusade, we're going to have the military orders of knighthood created, called the Knights Templar, or the Knights of the Temple of Solomon, or the Templar Knights, whatever you want to call them, okay? They were created by a knight that sympathized with the hardships of these Christian pilgrims trying to get over to Jerusalem. So these guys banded together to protect the Christians on their pilgrimage to the Holy Land. Now, the Templar Knights took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, and they were given headquarters near the ruins of the Temple of Solomon, which is, again, where the name comes from. Supposedly, Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, who we're going to hear about more later in another chapter, supposedly Saint Bernard of Clairvaux was supposedly inspired the creation based on the rules for his own Cistercians, and confirmed by the Pope in 1128. Okay, so the Templar Knights, there's a lot of legends about them, but we do know that they actually did help start the banking system in Europe. So that's one thing. Now, another military order that starts during the First Crusade is the Hospitallers, also known as the Knights of the Hospital of St. John of Jerusalem. That was founded around the same time, practically, as the Templars. So we've got knights and chaplains and brothers under the command of a grand master, with branches over in East in the Byzantine Empire and over in Western Europe. These two military orders were really effective. Each one of them had their own uniform. The Templar Knights are going to wear red crosses on a white background. The Hospitallers wore white crosses on a black background. And both orders are going to grow pretty wealthy, considering especially they took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. But they are going to grow pretty wealthy. And as I said, the Templars definitely play a part in the banking system in Europe at some point. So again, they're a cantankerous bunch, these knights. And so eventually, the original intent to protect the Christian pilgrims was going to be lost as the knights were fighting with each other. And they often did some things that didn't make any sense. Right? They started allying themselves with Muslims. They started losing their way to the point where they broke their vows of poverty. And that's how they got into banking. So in the early 1300s, King Philip IV, who you'll also hear about later, but King Philip IV is going to actually disband the Templar Knights. Now, according to legends, they were never disbanded, but that's a conversation for in-person class if I ever heard one. But the Hospitallers are going to still be around for a long time under different names. So anyway, those two are also pretty important that they came about during that First Crusade. So anyway, as I said, Peter the Hermit, all that. So the First Crusade was actually, again, successful for the European Christians, but it's going to be partially due to the fact that the Europeans were they were over there trying for a specific goal, but then the Muslims were not very united, and they're even kind of fragmented. So later on, the Muslims are going to unite, and then they're going to end up taking back a lot of the Crusader states that were gained by the Europeans. Now, I'm not going to talk about, like I said, all of these crusades, because there's either, again, 8 or 9, depending on, how you count those. There is an event that I would like for you to look about in your book called The Children's Crusade of 1212 I'm not going to really say much about that because it's not something that's all that terribly important. But as far as that goes, I'd like for you to know it. It's more maybe legend than it is fact, but it's still a really interesting thing to know regarding the Crusades. So be sure to look that up and make sure that you're aware of the Children's Crusades, or the Children's Crusade, rather. So again, without going into detail about all of the Crusades, you could probably, if you're really interested in history, at some point, if you get up higher in history, you'll probably be able to find classes that go into a lot more detail on anything you want, like I told you in class before. But as far as the Crusades go, that's the main stuff. Now, the last couple of Crusades, the major Crusades, were going to be actually organized by King of France, Louis the Ninth. And in, like, I think it was 1248, Louis the Ninth is going to attack Egypt, trying to get, the Holy Land. And he was defeated. He was taken prisoner, and he was made to pay kind of a big ransom to be free. And anyway, he tried again later in, I think, let's see, 1568. It's 20, more than 20 years later. And they went down to North Africa, down to the area of Tunis, which is where Carthage was before, remember? And turns out that poor Louis the Ninth and a lot of his army guys are going to die from some version of the plague at that point. Now, it's not the big plague that we're going to talk about that goes a little bit later from 1347 to 1351 or 52. But anyway, the Christian possessions that they had gained in the Holy Land were being retaken. Acre, spelled like acre, A-C-R-E, A-C-R-E, sorry guys. That was the last stronghold of the Crusaders, and that's the last one that finally surrendered. And again, there's a little bit of discrepancy as to when they surrendered. Maybe 1271, maybe a little bit earlier, maybe a little bit later. So the Crusades, like the effect on European history, of course, is debatable. What we do know is that it broadened the perspective of both the Muslims and the Christians in some way or another. Okay, we know it did that. Now, meanwhile, back there during the period that, not exactly the same but there is overlap. There's going to be the Reconquista in Spain, where Christians are going in and taking Spain from the Muslims. And so that was also happening at the same time. But you're going to see that Muslims and Christians are going to have a lot more interactions in Spain that were more positive, I think. Now, the Crusades did indeed reduce the number of those cantankerous knights over there in Europe and gave them a chance to go fight. And some people say, this is what historians sometimes argue about, is were the kings over in Europe able to get more control, gain more control? Because remember, during feudalism, the kings didn't have much power. They were figureheads. But were they able to get more control over their governments and take back a lot of power? Because so many of the fighters, so many of that class had died in the Crusades. I don't know. I don't know if I agree with that or not. I've read things on both sides of that. Now, we do know that the Crusades are going to hurt the relationship between the Western, the old Western European, old Roman Empire and the Byzantine Empire, which is still going to be around, again, until 1453. And we're going to start to see that there's incredible success that came with the First Crusade, and it helped the European West to feel a little bit more confident. But still, it's not going to play out the way they wanted it to. So the Crusades, this was a long period of time. And that particular area in the world, the Holy Land, is always going to be, it always has been, it seems, in the news for something or another. Okay. Now, the last thing I want to mention to you is called the Fourth Lateran Council, Lateran, in 1215. This is a really important ecumenical council for the Catholic Church, and it was attended by hundreds and hundreds, probably maybe, I don't know, at least more than 1,000, because you're going to have a lot of bishops there, somewhere close to 400 bishops, close to 1,000 abbots and others from monasteries. You're going to have 71 patriarchs. So I don't know how many more there were. But the Fourth Council of Lateran is really important because Pope Innocent III calls this in November 1215, and he says that his purpose is to defend the Catholic faith and to help aid the Crusader states over in the Holy Land. So the Pope is going to present to this council 70 different decrees, okay, and they were going to be considered, and the council pretty much said, yeah, okay, they agreed with pretty much everything the Pope put before them, okay? Now, what we see at the Fourth Lateran Council, a couple things that I usually point out. First of all, there was the dogma of transubstantiation, which is the belief in the real presence, the belief in the Catholic Church that if you watch as the priest blesses, the host and well, let me start over with this. If that can be taken out in editing, that'll be taken out in editing. If not, I'm starting over, okay, because I'm actually kind of tired again. All right, so transubstantiation, okay, we've talked about this before. It's the doctrine where it's also called the real presence, where when the priest holds up the bread and on the wine, blesses them and so on, that they actually become the body and the blood of Jesus. Okay, and that's a really important part of the Roman Catholic faith. I think Episcopalians, I'm pretty sure, I was Episcopalian for a while, pretty sure Episcopalians believe that as well, and I think Lutherans, believe in that doctrine or dogma of transubstantiation. Okay, trans meaning change, substance, remember. Now, there's also going to be the Fourth Lateran Council some rules for conduct of the clergy, like the clergy are not allowed to get drunk. The clergy are not allowed to go hunting. The clergy are not allowed to perform surgical operations. You got to understand the time we're in. There weren't really any particularly well-educated doctors and physicians. Surgeons pretty much, you didn't want to go to a surgeon no matter what, because probably you would die from infection or something. So that was forbidden for the clergy. Now, the other one is the Easter duty. Easter duty commands every Christian, well, today every Catholic Christian, who's reached the years of discretion to confess their sins, all their sins at least once a year to their priest. Okay, that's called the Easter duty, at least once a year. Okay, now it also brings up something that is going to come up later when we talk about, we're going to talk about something, well, we're talking about a little bit later. You'll see it when we get to it. It's going to be in the 1300s. But there's one universal church of the faithful outside of which there's absolutely no salvation. Okay, so that's one of the things that they reinforce or that they accept at the Fourth Lateran Council. So the council is also trying to reinforce the fact that the church is the power in Europe, and they showed how much influence a pope could have. Okay, and the people place an emphasis on the church for their salvation, and that increases the power of the Pope, and that's not a new thing. I mean, the church has always been historically, the thing is, it's established with Jesus and so on. And the Pope is going to have a lot of power in some ways. I mean, there's some things the Pope can speak on and be infallible. You have the doctrine of infallibility, but that doesn't mean every time a Pope speaks, right? But the Pope can indeed cut off an entire kingdom from receiving the sacraments if the leader makes them angry. And that's a really powerful way to get the people to try to rebel against their leader, because the leader has cut the people from receiving the sacraments, and there's no salvation without receiving the sacraments according to the Fourth Lateran Council. So that's where we're going to end with the church in the High Middle Ages. It's been a kind of a pretty good ride for the church, but things are going to start to get a little bit different when we get into the next chapters about some of the power of the church is going to start to be chipped away at, because certain things are going to happen that really are natural events, and there's not much that people can do. Plus, there's some events that are going to take a big toll on the clergy, because the clergy are out there attempting to help the people of Europe. So anyway, I'm going to hope that this thing loads pretty quickly, because putting it on YouTube is sometimes the part that takes forever. Anyway, I will hope to hear from you guys with any questions anytime.